Hello, welcome to the conversation here on News Central Television. This is a show where we bring you regular updates on all the developing political stories on the continent and Gbenga, Aborowa.
And I'm Rita Omodia. It's a fast-changing world in the political space on the African continent. And we're going to be looking at situations going on in Libya and, of course, the African Union, Israel's observer status debate.
Now, let's begin in Libya, where there are now two prime ministers in the country. This comes after its parliament voted and named a rival, Fathi Bashagha, to replace the existing unity government's chiefs, Abdulhamid Beiba. The House of Representatives said its decision followed Prime Minister Abdulhamid Beiba's failure to hold presidential elections in December.
Bashagha and Beiba, both from the powerful western city of Misrata, have the support of rival armed groups in the Libyan capital and the surroundings. But observers fear Thursday's vote could repeat a 2014 schism, which saw two parallel governments emerge. The 2014 crisis had seen a UN-backed unity government face off against the parliament, which is backed by Eastern military chief Khalifa Haftar, another candidate in the election set for December.
Now, joining us to discuss this, Maha Jouini, author and Pan-African advocate from Nouakchott, Mauritania. And we also have Professor Mustafa Fetouri, a Libyan academic, award-winning journalist. He joins in from Paris, France. Welcome to the conversation.
Thank you.
Welcome, Professor Fetouri. I must say, it seems like you have a crystal ball in your hands because, just as predicted in our last conversation, Fathi Bashagha has been appointed as Prime Minister, and the interim incumbent has refused to step down, just like we discussed on Wednesday. But looking at situations before his appointment, the spokesperson for the parliament said he was unanimously chosen after his only rival, Khalil al-Beibas, stepped down. What do you think could have been the reason for this?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me again. And there are several reasons, actually, to remove Mr. Dbeiba, as we had discussed in the last conversation we had just a couple of days ago. And on top of them, of course, the failure of the government, his government of national unity, to go ahead with the elections. Actually, he tried his best not to have elections, as everybody else. This is not exclusively to him. In fact, even people in the parliament, including the speaker, Mr. Agil Salah, including the incoming Prime Minister, Mr. Bashagha, they don't want elections because they know they will be kicked out of the political scene altogether. So that's one thing. The other thing, as I mentioned before, is the high level of corruption in his government. And we already know that 4 of his ministers are in jail, which is something, not only embarrassing, but actually a serious trouble to any prime minister in any government in the world, when you have four ministers of your cabinet in jail. It's very, the decent thing to do is just to resign. And the other thing is he has been kind of defiant against the parliament for the second time. The first time was when he was stripped of the confidence or vote of confidence, which he was given in March, and then it was taken away from by the parliament from him in September. And he just did not recognize that. And he came out definitely and said, oh, well, I'm not going anywhere, and the parliament itself should go away. Well, these are just a few reasons why he was dismissed and replaced by Mr. Bashagha.
Now, what about the other rival? There were two opponents. We had Beibas and we also had Bashagha. So what about the other one who stepped down? What could have been the reason for this?
Well, I think the other guy who was competing for the position of Prime Minister, Mr. al-Beibas, Khalid al-Beibas, I think he made a wise decision for himself by, withdrawing from the race before the parliament for the simple reason. He knows that his chances are very little. The competition was already, the race was already finished for him the moment he started against Bashagha. He is less qualified, of course. And the most important thing that probably made him, take such a wise decision for himself, actually, is the fact that he's very little known. He's not a well-known personality. He has not been tested, if you like, in government work, and his chances of, winning the recommendations before winning the vote itself, the recommendations by the High Council of State based in Tripoli were very minimum, and out of the probably 150 members of the council, he was very likely to get less than probably 10%, which is incomparable to Mr. Bashaga, who got unanimous vote, something like the maximum vote of the present members of the council, which were, I believe, something like 135 members were there yesterday, the day before yesterday. And I think now he will use, Mr. Bibas, he will use this as a gambling chip with Mr. Bashaga when he takes office as a prime minister in 15 days' time, and could negotiate something for himself, like being ambassador somewhere, or appointed to government, minister job or something. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Fetouri. I'd like to bring in Maha here. Maha, just hours before the selection of the new Prime Minister by the Libyan Parliament, the former Prime Minister, if we may call him that now, Abdulhamid Dbeibah, who refused to step down, escaped an assassination attempt. We do know the political temperature and security situation in Tripoli. There's quite a number of rival militias are operating there.
Yes.
Was that a warning to Dbeibah, or a missed attempt to his life, or a sign of what to expect in the next coming days?
Okay. First of all, I would love to thank you for inviting me as a speaker and analysis at the conversation. And this special thing because I'm honored to be next to Professor Mustafa Fetouri. I'm proud of you, sir. And despite of the war, despite of all what happened in Africa, we have brave authors and thinkers like you who can tell us the truth and who can guide us as people and as women, as you. Thank you, sir. Thank you. I'm honored to meet you today. Well, regarding your question, I like to say that our concern today, right away, after the decisions and after having Bashaga as a prime minister, after the refusing of Dbeibah to see Bashaga at that position, after the attempt of assassinating him, is the re-emergence of the war between the whole Libyan parties. I mean, the return of 2014 scenario, the outbreak of war, the poverty, the killing, the human rights violation. And what happened in 2014, it didn't affect Libya only, it affected Tunisia, where I do come from, it affected Algeria, Egypt, the whole North Africa. We cannot move to build peace without our Libyan brothers. We can say it loudly today that peace in Libya, stability in Libya means peace in the whole region. So today, all North African countries, all African countries have to enhance communication between all Libyan parties, and they have to bring the whole voices together and ensuring the security and the stability of the country, and supporting a real comprehensive national dialogue between Libyan. This is what we really need today. We need to stop war. We need to let people and to let Libyan leaders learn that democracy is a need to survive. It's not a question of who win against who. No. Democracy means rules of living together. They cannot live together without building democracy, without understanding each other. And now I'm really afraid. I cannot say that I'm happy or no, I'm satisfied with the last decisions. No, I don't know, really. What I'm concerned with now, my concern is to stop war, that these people commit to stop killing each other. Because the first results of all this is poverty, famine, and security in Libya. This is the results, and we need to stop it.
Okay, but Maha, who do you think were the masterminds behind the assassination attempt on Beba?
Sorry, I didn't get your question.
Who do you think were the masterminds? Who do you think were behind the assassination attempt on Beba?
No matter who is behind that, but the first result is instability in Libya. That's the first result. This is what they need, is to let this country unsecured and unstable. So for me, to really have a peaceful country, a powerful country, where Libyans can enjoy their resources, they can build their real economy, they can realize a real nation. Comes only when the war ends, when assassination attempts end, because the one who is behind that is the one who gets beneficiaries of this situation of insecurity and of instabilities.
All right. Okay, Maha, while you're talking about stability in Libya, let's take a look at the new prime minister who was instituted yesterday, or rather who was elected yesterday, that's Bashagha. Let's hear what he had to say, because he said so many things about an inclusive government in Libya.
الحكومة القادمة ستكون حكومة للجميع وبالجميع، ونمد أيدينا للجميع بدون استثناء. ثالثاً، سنتعاون دائما مع مجلسي النواب والدولة، ولا يمكن لحكومة أن تنجح دون التعاون والعمل المشترك مع السلطة التشريعية. رابعا، لا مكان للكراهية ولا مكان للحقد ولا مكان للانتقام ولا مكان للظلم. حكومة الوحدة الوطنية برئاسة المهندس عبد الحميد دبيبة، والذي تحمل مسؤولياته في فترة صعبة. وهذه هي الديمقراطية التي تضمن وتكفل التداول السلمي على السلطة.
Now, Professor Fetouri, you heard from Bashagha there. He called for an all-inclusive government. He said no to political instability and so many things. In your own position, you've heard from Maha also calling for stability in Libya. Do you think that is possible? Do you think he will be able to deliver on this mandate?
Well, thank you for the nice words, Maha, and I'm very pleased to take part in the discussion with you. For Mr. Bashagha, what we heard him saying is just the kind of nice words he's supposed to say at this stage. He has not yet taken any position, his position, I mean, and the situation in the next 2 weeks actually have the potential to derail everything. It depends now on what Mr. Beba can do, if he's willing to do anything to disrupt this and claim that he is the legitimate prime minister, as he still does, you know, like Mr. Trump in the United States. I wouldn't read too much of what Mr. Bashagha said, because I know for a fact, for example, he's one of the people who doesn't want to elect, once he's in power, doesn't want elections anytime soon. That's one thing. Second thing, there are several, if you like, black spots in his CV, if we look carefully. Mr. Bashagha is well known, a militia leader. He gave up this kind of work or job in the end of 2012, but only after he took part in a number of battles, against the government of late Colonel Gaddafi. And he was one of the top leaders, political as well as military leaders from Misrata, organized the invasion of Bani Walid just next door to them. And he has been implicated in the displacement also of about 40,000 people from the town of Tawarga, just about 20 kilometers east of Misrata, his hometown. On top of that, he has been on the record, in a video, taped video clip, whereby he was bragging about the fact that he helped NATO destroy Libya in 2011. And people did not yet forget all this. On top of this, when he was the interior minister in the previous government in 2019, he was the driving force behind the infamous, if you like, security deal that his government of Mr. Sarraj, his former boss, signed with Turkey, which was rejected by the parliament and also rejected by the majority of people. He also went on the record in 2019 in a press briefing, actually an interview with an American press agency, news agency, I don't remember, I think it's Bloomberg at the time, whereby he offered the United States, if it wants to have a base in Libya, something that never existed in Libya after 1969. So he's not, we should not judge him by the nice words he's saying now. Of course, he is going to say them. There's no other choice for him but to be nice at the first time, appearing for the first time. The other point I would like to comment on, you raised the question with Maha, is the attempt of Mr. Gbenga's life just 2 days ago. First of all, if it happened, really, of course, it's condemned, it's total terror, it's totally rejected, but I really very much doubt that such a thing happened. And if it did happen, the likely party who would have, mounted something like this or done something like that is just normal criminal. It has nothing to do with politics. Okay. But I really doubt it did take place. I'm sorry. Okay. Yes.
So, Professor Fetouri, you just talked about, we just looked at Bashaga's CV. It appears those that are jostling for power in Libya are quite divisive. You have Saif al-Islam, you have Beba himself, you also have General Khalifa Haftar in the east, and it seems there's no one without a skeleton in the cupboard. But let's talk about General Khalifa Haftar. He and Beba's Libyan National Army have welcomed Bashaga's appointment, while the United Nations continues to recognize Beba as interim prime minister. What does this mean for Libya, for the political arrangements in Libya, knowing that the East has always not been in agreement with the government of national unity in Tripoli, but now you have General Khalifa Haftar in the East saying he supports this appointment of Prime Minister Bashaga?
Well, let's deal with the United Nations part of the question. Of course, the United Nations continues to recognize Mr. Beba as the only prime minister in Libya because Mr. Bashaga, the incoming prime minister, has not formed this government. He will have to form a government and then go back to the parliament and ask for a vote of confidence. That will happen within the next 2 weeks. He has a maximum of 15 days to do so. So that part it doesn't mean anything if the United Nations says it continues to recognize Mr. Beba or not at this stage. It will be a totally different thing if, after Mr. Bashaga presents his government to the parliament and gets the vote of confidence, as he's expected, and then the United Nations comes out and says, oh, well, no, we don't recognize him. Of course, that's very unlikely to happen. But if it happens, that will be a serious trouble. But I don't expect it to happen. That's one thing. The other thing is to deal with Mr. Haftar. Mr. Haftar is quite a problematic figure in the country. He's a very divisive figure. But then the idea of welcoming Mr. Bashar goes back to the fact, of course, we have to remember that throughout 2019 and 2020, Mr. Haftar and Mr. Bashar were used to be astonished enemies of each other. And what they have said about each other in the media is just terrible. You cannot be imagined. But then Mr. Bashar took the unusual step and a very courageous step, in my opinion, when he visited Mr. Haftar's a couple of months ago in his headquarters in eastern Libya, in Benghazi. Then both men, they just struck a deal instantly during that visit that they would work together. And one of the ideas they discussed at the time that Haftar will not reject Mr. Bashar's nomination to be prime minister. Of course, at the time, there was the idea of presidential election, and both of them, Mr. Haftar, Mr. Bashar, and the rest of the guys who were running for a president, they were also running for a president, and they came out in Benghazi in the press statement, and they said, okay, what happened has happened. Now we will work together again. We don't want any war anymore into violence, and we will go to the ballot box, and people will decide. Of course, we never went to the ballot box, but the two men struck that deal. So Mr. Haftar needs something from Bashar when he becomes a prime minister, and he has got that promise to deliver. And what is that? It's money, because most of the army under Mr. Haftar, estimated to be around 20,000 people or so, has not been paid for months because Haftar lacks the money. He doesn't have money anymore to pay. So Mr. Bashar, unlike Gbenga, promised them once he's in office, he will pay the whole salaries of the whole army in eastern Libya, like if it was not a kind of, invading army that was attempting to invade Tripoli just less than a year ago. So it's what really, I think, pushed Mr. Haftar to accept such a deal and accept meeting Mr. Bashar after all that he said about him in the first place was the fact that he was losing increasingly his influence, particularly in Eastern Libya, and particularly within the parliament headed by the speaker, Mr. Aqil Saleh, who supported him unequivocally in 2019 when he attempted to take Tripoli by force. So he doesn't want to be left alone in the political scene. Yes.
Professor Fetouri, it seems like a give and take politics. Now, Maha, I'm coming to you, but there was a point you rightly gave, because you're talking about averting a civil war. Now, Fetouri, the second Libyan civil war was a multi-sided civil war that lasted from 2014 to 2020. You had Maha talk about it. And with these different factions emerging, seeing what is going on, I know on Wednesday, you said lots of things about a civil war occurring in Libya. But Fetouri, Professor Fetouri, can a civil war be averted even with all this that is happening?
How a civil war be?
I'm sorry, Maha, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I didn't listen the last part of the question. How
can a civil war be averted?
I think, and I believe that Bashar, he really understood the question and the concern of the whole international actors, peace actors, government leaders, and so on. And he delivered a speech in a way to calm people down. And he in his speech, he emphasizing the peace, the coexistence between all Libyan parties in a way to answer to the question that we are going to stop the civil war, that civil wars won't happen again. However, according to what happened after Skhirat's agreement in 2015 in Morocco, when after the Skhirat agreement, though the civil war continued by Haftar, Haftar didn't commit to any international recommendation, didn't commit to Skhirat agreements, didn't commit to international human laws, he didn't commit to anything. And the war continued. Today, the question to Bashar and his colleagues, are they going to abide to human rights and to stop the war? And do they have a strategy to end and eradicate civil war and killing in Libya or not? This is the real concern today.
Thank you very much. Maha, just before we wrap things up, Professor Fetouri, we've seen how complex the situation is in Libya, and in order not to repeat the events of 2014, the civil war, what would you propose as a solution to all of this fast-moving events in Libya?
Like Beji Qaid al-Sibsi, the ex-Tunisian president proposed, like the current Tunisian president, Qais Said, proposed, and when he received tribal leaders in Tunisia to discuss with them, we need a dialogue and we need Libyan leaders to commit to peace. This is how we can end civil war. This is the solutions, because they were spending around 7 years of dialogues, 7 years of advocacy, of campaigning, of discussion, writing, recommending them for peace, bringing them together for so
All right,
many...
Maha, let's hear from Professor Fetouri. Can a dialogue solve the situation?
They have to commit. They have to commit for peace.
Maha, sorry. Let's hear from Professor Fetouri. Sorry.
Yeah, please. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, of course, dialogue is always welcome. It's always the best way to avoid war. But I really don't think there will be a kind of a serious war in Libya over what happened with the prime minister. He's going out and the new one is coming in. And I have several reasons for that. First of all, both of them are from Misrata. And Misratans don't want, the top leadership, social leadership in Misrata, who has the ultimate decision in the city and the tribe itself. They do not like to see two of its people fighting over something that was done by the parliament. None of them has actually worked for this or has the power to impose himself. That's one thing. Second thing, the backing Mr. Beba enjoys, actually, whatever it is, it does not have the military power to mount any serious challenge, like, for example, he will not give up his post or the government offices where he is. He doesn't have that power behind him. Even the militias in Tripoli are not supporting him. Just last night, I was talking to some militia leaders in Tripoli, and they told me we are not supporting him because he was such a liar to them. That's what they said. He promised a lot of money, and he never paid a penny. That's the second reason. The third reason, it's unlike 2014, when we have a division between east of the country, where the parliament fled from Tripoli, and west of the country, where the rest of the government stayed. We don't have that division now. Why? Because we have the parliament in full agreement with the Council of State based in Tripoli. The parliament is in Tobruk in the east. And then the only fighting force that's capable of mounting some serious military challenge to any central authority coming from eastern Libya is Mr. Haftar. and Mr. Haftar is not going to fight Mr. Bashar because they are already in agreement. So it's very, we could have, you know, we could have some skirmishes, if you like, in Tripoli, around the capital, east of the capital, probably. But that's not a serious thing to do, to go ahead and go on for days, for example. Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Mustafa Fetouri and Maha Jouini. It was a pleasure having you both to talk about the current situation in Libya. Thank you. We did appreciate your insight.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
You're watching The Conversation on News Central Television. We'll go on a break, and when we come back, we'll be looking at the African Union and Israel's debate over its membership and observer status in the African Union. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Hello, Naim and Roshan. Thank you very much for joining us. We do appreciate your time. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. Are you both in Johannesburg?
Yes, we are.
I am.
Okay, great. Look forward to a great conversation.
So can I get the names of the two of you?
My name is Rita. Rita.
And I'm Gbenga. Pronounced, you could just
Sorry.
Benga. Yeah, that's what they used to call me.
Okay.
If you just join us on the conversation, we've been looking at the politicking in Libya, where the country now has two prime ministers. The African Union has suspended a debate on whether to withdraw Israel's accreditation, avoiding a vote that risks creating an unprecedented rift in the 55-nation member bloc. The relationship with Israel is a rare point of contention for a body that values consensus with powerful member states, notably the Republic of South Africa, loudly protesting a decision last July by the African Union Commission chairperson Mustafa to accept Israel's accreditation to the bloc as an observer status member.
Now, an observer status at the African Union allows observer states to attend open sessions of the AU's Peace and Security Council and the opening and closing sessions of AU summits. Observers are also given limited access to AU documents and may be invited by the Commission chairperson to take part in meetings and make statements. They cannot vote. As the summit opened last Saturday, Palestinian Authority Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayyeh urged African leaders to withdraw Israel's AU accreditation, denouncing its apartheid regime.
Your Excellencies, I'm sorry to report to you that the situation of the Palestinian people has only grown more precarious. A few days ago, Amnesty International published a report confirming that Israel is not only guilty for denying Palestinians our human rights, but that Israel is also committing the most grave crimes, the crime of apartheid. Israel should never be rewarded for its violation and for the apartheid regime it does impose on the Palestinian people. As an entity, Israel has progressed from extremism to militarism to colonial expansion. This must stop. We call for the withdrawal and objection of Israeli observer status at the African Union. We believe that granting Israel observer status at the African Union is undeserved reward. This actually a reward that encourages Israel to continue violating international treaties, breaching all agreements with us.
To discuss this conversation, we will be speaking to Roshan Dadoo, coordinator of the South African BDS Coalition, and Jeenah, the executive director at Afro-Middle Center in Johannesburg, South Africa. One welcome to you both to the conversation.
Thank you very much.
Now, I'd like to start with Roshan. What was your reaction to the African Union's suspension of the debate in Israel's observer member status, and they've pushed it to the next summit in 2023?
Well, as the member of the South African BDS coalition, which is also part of the Pan-African Palestine Network, we were extremely disappointed and in fact outraged yet again that the decision has not been rescinded, firstly, and secondly, that the confusion that was brought about by lobbying on the part of Israel, so that in fact the decision that was made in the morning, by the evening, had changed so that the committee was still accepted, that we had thought was a good thing, a committee of 3 countries in favor of the accreditation and 3 against. Of course, South Africa, Algeria, and Nigeria are amongst those other 3 that opposing the accreditation of Israel. But that Israel could lobby and put pressure on countries, and we know that countries, even Senegal, has signed recently, the president, now the AU chair and chair of this committee, a huge military deal with Israel. So you can see that the whole matter has not been dealt with in a way that's in accordance with the Constitutive Act of the African Union or the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, both of which clearly commit the African Union to fighting colonialism, settler colonialism, racism, and indeed Zionism.
Okay, now Naeem, we saw the AU suspending the debate till next year, and as Roshan clearly said, she called it quite disappointing. Now, the AU Commission chairperson, Mustafa Mohammed, defended the decision to give Israel observer status, calling it an instrument in the service of peace. So Naeem, does Mohammed have the right to unilaterally grant Israel an observer status?
So the AU Commission chair does have the power in terms of AU procedures to grant accreditation to non-African states. This is a power that he or she does have. However, in considering whether to grant such accreditation, it is required by AU procedures and regulations that the AU Commission chair needs to consider the AU Constitutive Act, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, as Roshan Dadoo pointed out, as well as the known views and opinions of member states. So the argument by countries such as Algeria, South Africa, Namibia, and Nigeria is that in fact this wasn't done. That in fact the fact that Israel runs foul of numerous provisions of the AU Constitutive Act, as well as of the African Charter, particularly, I mean, the Charter calls on African states to fight against Zionism, which is the political ideology of the Israeli state. The fact that Israel runs foul of these, as well as the fact that Mustafa Mohammed knows that there are a number of member states that oppose Israel's accreditation, that should have given him cause to pause and not to simply do the kind of procedural thing of granting the accreditation. This is the argument. Yes. And when one looks at the merit of the argument, I mean, there is merit to that argument, in that certainly on such a divisive issue, even though he has the power to accredit, on such a divisive issue, he should have consulted the Executive Council at the very least.
Yeah, but in his defense, Mustafa Mohammed, staying with you, Naeem, has noted that more than 40 of the African Union's member states had diplomatic relations with Israel. So they suggested that they might not perhaps or should not object to Israel's similarly having diplomatic relations with the African Union. Do you agree with this reasoning? If you have diplomatic relations with a country, does it necessarily imply that you also support the country in having an observer status at the African Union?
No, it doesn't. I mean, it's clear, except for Algeria, the other 3 states, that are most loudly objecting, all have diplomatic relations with Israel. But all 3 are insisting that their bilateral relations with Israel does not mean that they support Israel's accreditation to the continental body, that they are 2 different things. Also, we know that in the case of South Africa, for example, that while South Africa hosts an Israeli embassy, which Mustafa Mohammed kind of pointed to in a bit of an insulting way in his comment, while South Africa hosts an Israeli embassy, the South African embassy in Tel Aviv over the past few years has been in the process of being downgraded as per the resolution of the ruling party. We have not had an ambassador there for almost 8 years. I think the highest official in the embassy is a first secretary, and there's procedures in place to downgrade that even further. So for him to point to the fact that 40 odd countries, so almost 2/3 of member states have diplomatic relations, is really it's kind of disingenuous, but it's also opportunistic to try and make his point and attack the opposition.
Okay, Roshan, over to you now. You've heard the defense now of the AU chairperson. But in an open letter, the BNC called on all AU member states to reject Israel's request for observer status without hesitation. Now, seeing the defense of Mohammed, he said about more than 40 of the AU members, 55 member states had diplomatic relations with Israel. He also said that it was an instrument of peace to have Israel, to give Israel an observer status. Why is your organization opposed to Israel's status as an observer in the AU?
Well, firstly, as has been mentioned, in the very week that Amnesty International, the third major human rights organization, along with Human Rights Watch and the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem, published a report that clearly evidences in 280 pages exactly how Israel practices the crime of apartheid. And apartheid is a crime against humanity. And this is not just Amnesty saying this off the top of its head or Palestine solidarity activists saying it's an apartheid state. The evidence is there. Even Israelis, the former one of the former senior members of the government there, the judiciary, has also said, in fact, yes, it does commit the crime of apartheid, and that the crime of apartheid as a crime against humanity ought to be punished in the same way that South Africa under apartheid was. So as Palestine solidarity activists in the continent, we hope that countries will stop diplomatic relations with Israel altogether. All of the countries that do have diplomatic relations, and I saw today that Nigeria has just welcomed a new Israeli ambassador who is also accredited to ECOWAS. Now, how do we have an apartheid state sending new ambassadors accredited to our regional and sub-regional bodies when it's a country that's clearly committing the crime of apartheid, a crime in international law? That is increasingly being acknowledged by governments, by people around the world. So I think that's one point. The second point is how on earth an apartheid state could contribute towards peace, when in fact, I mentioned the fact that the Senegalese president had signed a large military deal just recently. What Israel is doing in the continent is selling weapons, selling spyware that, Pegasus, as the NSO company, has even been banned in the US, but we know it's being bought by governments on our continent. And in fact, these things are used against us. If you look at the coups that are taking place more rapidly now again in the continent, it's not a coincidence that it coincides with Israel's push into the continent and its lobbying, bribery, and corrupt deals it does with authoritarian leaders in our continent.
Now, I'd like to bring in Naim here. From what Roshan has said, we see a lot of quid pro quo going on between Israel and a lot of African states, which has left it more divisive. Now, Israel has been trying to win back observer status for 20 years since it lost it when the Organization of African Unity was disbanded in 2002 to make way for its replacement organization, the African Union. Libyan leader then, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, was behind Israel's ouster. Israel again tried to get accredited to the AU in 2013 and 2016. So my question to you, Naim, is this. Why is Israel so desperate to get an observer status in the AU? What's in it for Israel?
Firstly, I think we must be careful about kind of dumping the whole issue onto one person or one country. Certainly, the Israelis would like to do that. So Israel not being accredited when the AU was formed was, not just because of Gaddafi, but there was a whole groundswell against it. Similarly, in the other two bids that it made, and currently, the Israelis would like to dump the whole thing on South Africa, for example,
yes.
When we know that South Africa is one of a group of countries that's opposing it. Why do they want to get into the AU? There's a few reasons for this. One is that with all of the kinds of relations that are developing that Roshan has pointed out, being on the continental body or being accredited to the continental body helps to take that even further. Secondly, that while accredited non-African states don't have access to closed meetings of the AU, they do have the kind of access that Rita pointed out earlier on, opening and closing sessions of these big meetings, certain documents, if they are approved by the AU Commission chair, etc., etc. But I think more importantly, that they have access to the corridors when summits and executive council meetings are taking place. And a lot of the lobbying at the AU happens in the corridors, not in the closed meetings. Having access to that is a huge thing. And finally, that Israel has been trying literally for decades to break the kind of block vote that Africa has in multilateral fora like the UN General Assembly, where, for example, if there was a resolution that comes up condemning Israeli apartheid or Israeli settlements, both of which are illegal under international law, usually Africa would vote as a bloc. Israel has been trying for decades, as I say, to break that block so that you don't have 53 or 54 now votes against it. And getting accredited to the African Union, it believes, will help it to make cracks in that. So we see that not only does it want to be accredited to the AU, but it's also making strenuous attempts to break the kind of singular opinions within the regional economic communities. One of its big problems is SADC, for example, and it's now succeeded in breaking the SADC bloc with the DRC supporting it, for example.
All right, Roshan. Now, Muhammad said the AU's commitment to the Palestinian push for independence was unchanging and can only continue to go stronger. He also defended Israel's accreditation. Isn't that a contradiction? And what are your thoughts on this?
Well, we find it extremely contradictory. I mean, if the AU was serious about the positions it's taken recently on Palestine, if it's serious about continuing the relationship that the OAU, the predecessor of the AU, had with the Palestinian people in struggle against colonialism at the time that we were struggling still on our continent for independence and liberation, and up until the point that South Africa defeated apartheid, I think it's a total contradiction. There's no way that having an apartheid state, having that access, as you both mentioned, Rita and Naim, to the African Union can in any way be considered in line with supporting the Palestinian struggle for liberation. And I think the clip from the Palestinian Prime Minister's speech at the AU shows that. They are asking us, they are saying, we don't want apartheid Israel in the AU. We don't want to do business with apartheid Israel. We want to see boycotts, divestments, and full sanctions against an apartheid state.
Thank you, Roshan. Final question in 30 seconds, Naim. We've seen a lot of traditionally Arab states and Gulf states that were opposed to Israeli occupation of Palestine normalized relations, the Abraham Accords last year, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates. We've also seen some countries in the African Union warming up to the AU. What does this say about the conscience of those countries? Because there's money to be made, there are business deals and all of that. Does that take precedence over human rights and the situation, the catastrophic situation in Palestine?
Well, certainly for those states, that takes precedence over human rights. I mean, on our continent, the two states that recently normalized Morocco and Sudan. Morocco, which has its own colonial problem with the Western Sahara. But as African states, and particularly those of us in African states who live in democracies, we shouldn't be holding ourselves to the same standards as Arab dictatorships. We hold ourselves to the standards of the AU Constitutive Act, the African Charter, which are standards of democracy and liberation and freedom.
Okay, and finally, what do you think will be the possible outcome of next year's summit after this committee has met? And hopefully, I don't want to predict things. That's why you're the expert. What do you think will be the outcome of their resolution?
It's difficult to predict right now. Sorry about the intruder. The committee is going to do its work over the next few months, leading up to the next summit, perhaps even before that. The committee is split down the middle, 50-50%, with Senegal holding a kind of swaying vote there. So it doesn't seem like of the 6 countries, any of them is willing to budge. We hope that the right decision will be made in terms of the Constitutive Act and the African Charter, but right now it seems that politics and business for many African leaders seems more important.
Thank you very much. It's been an absolute...
What about you, Roshan? Let's hear your thoughts on it.
I just want to very quickly remind people that, in fact, today, the 11th of February, 32 years ago, Nelson Mandela walked out of prison. And I think if we remember his words that said, we will never be free until the Palestinians are free, we should really take that to heart as Africans all over the continent and in the African Union and our regional bodies.
Thank you so much, Roshan. Those were nice words from Nelson Mandela. Thank you so much for your insight. And of course, Naeem, thank you for joining us on the conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Whoa.
Lots at stake there. I mean, our fingers are crossed at what's going to happen to the observer status of Israel next year. Nigeria is among the committee. We also have other countries giving their recommendations for the AU observer status.
And of course, not to forget the ever-changing situation in Libya.
Yeah.
We'll definitely keep our eyes there. Thank you very much for being a part of the conversation today. I'm Gbenga, Aborowa.
And I'm Rita, Omodia. Till next week. Bye-bye.